longtime friends and also so many new people that I look forward to getting to know. For a little bit of tech check, since we're in hybrid mode, I want to make sure folks online can hear us. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear us. Great. And give you a few suggestions about how we'll run tonight with this new hybrid world. I've been saying that we really are building it as we are flying it. And so I know that together we will be learning how to use this space, integrated space and inclusive space together well throughout the weekend. Some tips for us. If you are joining online, we recommend that you set your Zoom view to speaker view. You can do that in the right-hand corner. And that way you'll be able to see the speaker and we'll still be able to see all of you. Speaker view. If you have any technical issues, you will see some FCNL staff on your screen identified as tech hosts. So look for that in their little name there. And you can send them a private chat. Just give them a little private chat if you need help. They're your first go-to help for tech online. If you can't reach them or something doesn't go through, you can also email it@fcnl.org. And we will keep an eye on that and try to help you through anything. I'll say a little bit about our program this evening. I'm so excited for the conversations that we're going to be having following what I think was a day full of training and education and engagement. How many folks just came from a state training session? Excellent. On the screen, hands are waving, wonderful. As we prepare for lobbying all day tomorrow, there are 150 visits set up across the House and the Senate on the Environmental Justice for All Act. We have wonderful speakers. You're going to hear a lot more about this from Clarence and this wonderful lineup later on. I want to pause before we dive in, also just to acknowledge for a moment the land upon which we gather, which was the original homeland of the Nacotchtank people, also called the Anacostans. They lived along the Anacostia River. And I want to invite us just to take a pause in a moment and to honor and remember the land that we gather upon and who was here first. And I invite people on Zoom to put in the chat your name, where you're from, or where you're zooming in from. And if you know the peoples who were the original inhabitants of the land upon which you're zooming in from, please feel free to add that in the chat as well. We'll just take a moment. Thank you, friends. We'll do that a couple times throughout the weekend, just to remind ourselves. So, as I said, I'm not new to FCNL, and in fact, joined for the first time FCNL as a young adult in what was then the intern program in 1996. And I remember coming to Washington, D.C. for the first time, feeling like a young person from Ohio who didn't know much at all about Congress, so intimidated to go on a lobby visit to Congress. I didn't even know you could do that. And then the experience of learning with FCNL, being trained, being brought into the space of how FCNL lobbies, and the empowerment that it gave me. It was such an empowering experience to discover I could lobby my member of Congress and bring my voice to Washington. And in fact, I think I've learned something, because as some of you may know, right now, as we're gathering here, the new members of Congress are also gathering in this very hotel for their orientation. And so I saw one of them in the elevator, and I just reached out my hand and introduced myself, told her about FCNL, first woman representative from Vermont. Anyone from Vermont? She's here in the hotel, yes. So there's already lobbying happening. It's a wonderful opportunity for us. These things tend to happen at an annual meeting. And in fact, I'm going to turn it over to LaTricea now. For those of you who don't know LaTricea, she leads our young adult program. Give it up for LaTricea. And there is no one who can warm up a crowd like LaTricea after a lobby training. So please come and share a little bit with us.
Hello, thank you for the love in the back. That's the Advocacy Corps over there. Shout out to the Advocacy Corps. So our Advocacy Corps is a group of young adult organizers we hire every year to work on one legislative issue. It changes every year. We not only have current organizers here from this program, but alum who did work on the Environmental Justice for All Act last year. For 10 months, they lobbied on this bill. And a lot of the learnings we had from that time really did influence the way we are gonna train all of you and continue talking about the bill tonight. So thank you to all of those alumni who are here. And I do want to get people excited about the visits tomorrow. So we did just assign roles. All of you came back from state trainings. I saw lots of hands. Can I see who are the note takers? Can I get a wave? Yeah, okay, over Zoom, some waving. Who are the note takers? Thank you. You all are gonna make sure that we know what happened in those visits. You'll submit those report backs, please and thank you. And we will just have way more strategic lobbying after getting all of that information. So what about our group leaders? Who here is volunteering as a group leader? Okay. What about over Zoom, group leaders? I see some hands, awesome. So you all are gonna make sure that these visits flow, that people know when they're supposed to be speaking. Thank you so much for doing that. What about our storytellers? Can I get some hands? Who's sharing their story? Awesome. Okay, so if you are sharing a story and you are not sure yet what you're gonna say, I want you all to think during this next panel, why do I care about environmental justice? What is leading me to be at this event, to be doing this advocacy? And what does a world with environmental justice look like? That's the question I keep asking myself when I think about why do I lobby for this bill and for this issue? And then, okay, if you're not in any of those three roles, but you're doing something else, you're speaking in some other way, can I get a raise of hands? You're maybe sharing the ask, okay? You're giving a thank you. Round of applause for those people as well. So thank you all for taking on all of those roles. I'm really excited to hear how the visits are gonna go tomorrow. And to Bridget's point, the lobbying has already started. I wanna share a really fun story that I got from one of these wonderful alum. This morning, this individual was on a flight with Senator Warnock himself. Yes, texted me from the plane, oh my goodness, guess who's on my flight? Should I talk to him? I said, go for it. Now, I could not talk to her while she was on the flight, so I was waiting in anticipation to hear what happened. And this person actually, from her seat during this flight, wrote up a one-pager on the Environmental Justice for All Act, handed it to Senator Warnock on their way off the plane, and lobbied him right then and there. So congratulations to that individual, the Advocacy Corps doing awesome work. I'm really excited that that's how I got to start my day. The staff got to hear that story as soon as I heard it. And I hope it gets everyone else excited about the fact that we carry our stories with us. We carry the passion that we have for this issue with us, and we can be advocating on this issue at any point, right? Maybe we're on a flight with a senator or we're talking to a family member about the issue, right? We can be advocating all the time. I'm really excited for our lobby visits tomorrow. Congratulations to all of you for being here and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larissa. I should say also that this lobbying, it has a lasting impact. In that elevator with that member of Congress, when I said, I'm with the Quaker lobby, FCNL, she said, oh, Quakers, we love you Quakers in Vermont. So it makes a difference. They remember us. So now I'm very happy to turn us over in a minute to Clarence and our distinguished panel, who's going to tell us more about the Environmental Justice for All Act and how we can advance it. The program tonight is going to be dedicated entirely for the rest of the time to this talk, and the Edward F. Snyder Award that's on your program is moving to a later time in the program. So just wanted to let you know that. For the question and answer period in this hybrid fashion, also want to let you know that you will have options. We will have the chat open throughout the event, so you can put your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll keep track of those and gather some for the Q&A time. You can also, if you're online with us, you can raise your electronic hand when it gets to the Q&A time. And then in the room, we will also take questions from the room, and we'll try to be as balanced and inclusive through that whole process as we can be. And if you have any trouble, remember the tech hosts online can help you. So Clarence Edwards is our legislative director for environment and sustainable energy and sustainable environment and energy. And I got to know Clarence early on when I came on as general secretary, when we went and visited a solar plant, community-led solutions, climate solutions. And what I will say about Clarence, you can read his bio on our website, is that he is not only a brilliant strategist, lobbyist, political analyst, he knows these issues inside and out, but he is constantly thinking first and foremost about what the issues mean for those who live them. What is the impact of environmental harm on communities in the front lines? What are their needs, perspectives, voices? And the bill that we are lobbying on, the Environmental Justice for All Act, is a remarkable model of ensuring that the people most impacted by the issues that we're trying to address are at the table and included in the process of developing the solutions. So I'm really excited to turn the time over to Clarence now and the panel that he'll be introducing us to. Thanks so much, Clarence.
Bringing my laptop with me so I remain brilliant. But hello, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you in person and online. Seeing some people who I've only seen on Zoom in the past couple of years. So it's really cool that we're able to do this. So my name is Clarence Edwards, and I'm the head of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Program for FCNL. And we're really excited to be talking about this bill. And the first thing I want to do is just really be sure that we know about the ask. And our ask is for our representatives up on Capitol Hill to co-sponsor, if they haven't already, and support the passage of the Environmental Justice for All Act. That's what we're here for. That's the bill that we want to see move, ideally during this lame duck session that's coming up, that's happening now. This bill empowers people to sue for intentional discrimination and requires an analysis of how pollution would affect surrounding communities before a permit for construction is granted. It directs federal agencies to document the environmental and human health risks of energy projects, of all projects, and authorizes funding to invest in frontline communities. Now, the issue of environmental justice has been around it's getting a lot of attention now in the past couple of years, but this is not a new issue. It's an issue that's been around for decades. It has its roots in, ironically enough, New Deal housing and redlining. And it also has its roots in something that we all know about, the 1968 Mississippi sanitation strike. But the modern environmental justice movement really took off in 1982 when a community in Warren County, North Carolina, which is not far from where my dad lives in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, protested the placement of a landfill in their community. And just a side note, I was talking to my dad about working on environmental justice, and he paused. He was listening to me and he paused. And he said, when I was a kid growing up in Rocky Mount, they opened a landfill 4 blocks away from our house. And so even when you don't think you have a connection to the issue, you do have a connection to the issue. Because I didn't think I had a connection to the issue, but that really brought it home. The federal government's response to this issue has been weak, to say the least, up until the past couple of years. The Biden administration put a lot of work into environmental justice, making it a centerpiece of their climate strategy. And also importantly, Chairman Raul Grijalva and Representative Donald McCutcheon from Virginia, Grijalva being from Arizona, introduced the Environmental Justice for All Act in March of 2021. I don't know what year it is anymore. And going back to what the Biden administration has done, it took some elements out of the original EJ for All Act and put them into an executive order. The Justice 40 initiative is something that was, I think originally, Chris will tell me if I'm wrong about this, I think it was originally part of the EJ for All, the White House Advisory Justice Council. So the White House has done a lot on this issue. The Inflation Reduction Act has $60 billion in funding for environmental justice. And I want you all to give yourselves a round of applause for the advocacy that you did to help pass the environmental justice, we'll get to that, the Inflation Reduction Act. Your advocacy and your grassroots work, twinned with the work that we were doing here in Washington, really made a difference. So you should be proud of that. But having said that, there's more to be done. This issue needs more than just one piece of legislation or so. It needs the kind of comprehensive approach, and it needs more than money. It needs some laws changed in order for environmental justice to really take hold in this country. And that's why we support the Environmental Justice for All Act. And we have 3 panelists with us. Well, yeah, we have 3 panelists with us today, one in cyberspace. I see you down there, Anthony. There you go. We have Anthony Kinslow, the founder and CEO of Gemini Energy Solutions. Anthony is a friend of mine and an expert in energy efficiency, analytics, and building science. And he's a research-oriented practitioner who utilizes best practices from around the world to develop innovative solutions for his clients. Anthony is very steeped in the intersection of energy efficiency, environmental justice, and how those issues come together to influence his work and his outlook. We have LaTricea Adams, who is someone I hope that I can call a friend of mine now. She's the founder and CEO and president of Black Millennials for Flint. And she also serves on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. LaTricea, and I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, LaTricea? Okay. Seeing the coverage of the Flint water crisis in 2015 made her realize how much we take clean and safe drinking water for granted in this country. She wanted to take action, and this led her to found Black Millennials for Flint, which is a grassroots environmental justice civil rights organization with the purpose of bringing like-minded organizations together to collectively take action and advocate against the crisis of lead exposure, specifically in African-American and Latino communities throughout the nation. My last friend, and I filled the panel with friends of mine, weighted in our favor. Chris Espinosa is Director of Outreach and Engagement for Chairman Raul Grijalva, the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. He's an experienced senior leader in public policy and national advocacy and coalition building. Previously, he served as the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for Green Latinos and served as Legislative Representative for Earth Justice. one of our allies in our work on advocacy here in Washington, D.C. So what we're going to do is have a conversation. I'll ask them some questions, and we also want you to be thinking about the questions that you may have around the bill. We have a person here who is, three people who are very steeped in environmental justice issues. It's not an easy bill to get your head around sometimes, maybe. I'll just say that for myself, not for you all. But if you have questions, be thinking of them, and because we have three experts here that can answer them. So I'm going to start out, and I'll just stay up here. No, I'm going to move over here. I feel like I'm on a game show. So I wanted to ask you, Chris, about, could you give us a sort of a background of how the chairman, what was the motivation behind the Environmental Justice for All Act? What led the chairman to and Representative McEachin to put the bill together?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And first of all, let me say thank you to the Friends Committee on National Legislation for all of the tremendous work that the organization has dedicated to this effort, going all the way back to the inputting process, which we can talk about. But what really led to the formation of the EJ for All Act goes back to Chair Grijalva's experiences early in his career as a local elected official in Tucson, Arizona. At the time, there had been a discovery of tremendous groundwater contamination of a chemical known as TCE. As the chairman began to familiarize himself with what was going on, one of the things that stood most out to him is that the individuals in the community that were being most impacted were individuals of color, low-income individuals. And the impact was certainly experienced by the entire community, but it was not experienced equally. And so that really cemented for him that environmental quality issues are deeply tied to issues of injustice and inequity. And he took that understanding with him, both at his time as a county supervisor and then when he went to Congress. So that was the impetus behind him wanting to comprehensively address environmental injustice. The formation of the bill itself really was through what I imagine he would say is trial and error. There was another bill that he had introduced. It was the Environmental Justice and Civil Rights Restoration and Enforcement Act, which is not nearly as easy to say as the Environmental Justice for All Act. But one of the things he learned from introducing that bill was it had one co-sponsor. It had very little support from the community. And what he learned is that the traditional policymaking process and the development of legislation was not going to work on an issue like environmental injustice. The very nature of environmental justice is that the communities that are often most impacted are left out of the conversation and out of the participatory sort of community-driven solutions aspect of addressing the issue. So he was determined not to replicate those mistakes. And he wanted to redesign how a bill gets made in Congress and put communities first in that process. And that's what led to the EJ for All Act.
Thank you for that. One of the interesting things about the bill is it's almost a human-centered design thinking process that seems to be at the foundation of it, where you have real community involvement in how the bill was crafted. And that's something that, I mean, I think that that's something that we should do with a lot of different bills. So thank you for that. LaTricea, you experienced these issues on the ground. We talked about Flint. Can you share some examples of how people on the ground and in their communities on an everyday basis are confronted with environmental justice? Because in Washington, it can sometimes feel a little removed, at least from my perspective, on these issues. But what is your experience with EJ on the ground in communities?
Yeah, so I would say, first, I would say there are some significant environmental justice issues right here in the nation's capital.
Oh, yes.
So the reason why I want to start with that, and it connects to how my whole journey to work in environmental justice got started. So with Black Millennials for Flint, interestingly enough, we were actually founded here in Washington, DC. And so we took our first trip. We had about almost 40 people with us. We had students who are actually from DC, east of the river. We also had young people from Philadelphia, a lot of young people at the time that came with us, parents that came to support and wrap their arms around Flint. When we were in Flint, maybe about 2 weeks after we returned back to the district with our students, those same students received letters from school that there was lead in their school drinking water.
Whoa.
Now, I know I'm not a DC native, but honestly, when I first moved to DC, the first thing people said is don't drink the water.
Yeah.
But honestly, when I first heard that, I didn't really think too much of it. I'm like, okay, but that's actually it's a confrontation with environmental injustice and thinking about where there are issues surrounding exposure of lead in drinking water. When you look at it from an equity perspective, while it is an issue that's pervasive within largely the district at large, is highly concentrated in those areas where there are Black and brown people. Of course, if you're familiar with DC, that will be in Ward 7 and Ward 8, for example, which essentially is where the majority of Black and brown people and people who experience economic disenfranchisement reside. I would take it a step further and to say, one of the things that I really appreciate in connecting it with the Environmental Justice for All Act is the emphasis on public health. So when we talk about environmental injustice, we have to think about body burden. And what body burden is essentially the cumulative toxins that build up in your body over time. And a lot of these things exacerbate other illness. So for example, like with COVID-19, we could not escape the inequity that we saw with that. A lot of times, if it was out of sight, out of mind, if we were not living in frontline communities, it wasn't necessarily something that we really thought about because it didn't really impact us, but you couldn't escape it when we experienced COVID-19, and it heightened a sense of awareness. And so when we think about it from a public health perspective, from a harm perspective, it takes me to Flint, Michigan, where we have a whole generation of people with irreversible damage due to some decisions that community had no control over, a switch that was literally $1 million. Just $1 million, that's chump change in exchange for a whole city that's poisoned. I think about Mari Copany, Little Miss Flint. I'm not sure if you remember her, she's super cute, but she's a teenager now, I can't believe this. And literally from the age of 6, the majority of her whole life was experienced with a Flint water crisis. But it's not just Flint, Michigan. Right. It's where we see Black and brown people throughout the nation. Jackson, Mississippi is another example where we see not just water issues that's siloed in this instance. It's been decades of issues that are around water quality and other environmental issues, not just in Jackson, but in rural Mississippi. When we think about, for example, Fannie Lou Hamer, she actually was very ahead of her time and talked about about some of the instances around like agriculture and the intersection with environmental justice, where that term wasn't necessarily coined then. The impact that it has on childbirthing people is something that is really critical to think about. And while I don't want to be daunting at this hour, I do think that there's a lot of optimism in the space that we're in right now, where we're looking at environmental justice from a very intersectional lens, where we're moving beyond the scope and narrative of environmentalism, which is very distinct from environmental justice. The huge difference is environmental justice is, like you said, is grounded in humanity. And so that's what makes an environmental justice for all act very unique, is that it's centered on people and crafted by people and really addresses what the essence of environmental justice is.
Beautiful. That switch you were talking about in Flint, at $1 million, was it just a, is it a switch on the water system or something?
So what actually initiated the Flint water crisis at that particular time, a GOP governor, Rick Snyder, was very much so around like budget, wanted to like cut corners. But when you cut corners, you don't cut corners on human beings. So when we think about just theoretically, the Flint River, so think about like, what is Flint known for? It's vehicle city. So definitely like an industry city, as is the neighboring city, Detroit. And so historically, the water system that was used by Flint residents was the Detroit water system. And so literally to cut corners to save a few dollars, they decided to switch to the Flint River. Now, what the issue was, first of all, it was dangerous to switch to the Flint River anyway, because it was so corrosive and highly polluted, but they literally did not treat the water appropriately. So literally left out an agent, and it literally destroyed everything in this city, just from a decision that literally had no community input. It disempowered even some decision makers from a local perspective. And we would be remiss if we didn't think about the demographics of that city and how that shows up from a disenfranchisement perspective. But literally that one decision by someone that had no connection, never lived in Flint, Michigan, literally changed the lives for people forever.
Wow, it's jarring. Anthony.
Hey, Clarence.
Good to see you. How does this issue intersect with what you do at Gemini Energy Solutions? Can you talk about that intersection between your work on energy efficiency? And I'm not doing your work justice when I just say, yeah, you work on energy efficiency, but you're a multifaceted person, and your organization is. So could you speak to how you impact, or how environmental justice issues impact your work and your perspective on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for having me. Sorry I couldn't be in person. I'm still recovering from COVID, and I was hoping I would get through the whole issue and not ever catch COVID, and that changed last week. But I'm so glad to be on the call with all of you and to see your wonderful faces. There's a lot of great things that the two previous speakers said that I'm like, we don't have time to really jump into deep in that. So I'm going to go stick right to your question, Clarence. I guess first, I'll break it off into two parts. The first is when accounting for environmental justice allows me to identify problems that the industry just fundamentally doesn't see. Perfect example of that is this huge recent boom of resiliency hubs. Everybody's talking about resiliency hubs, and that is adding battery storage and solar in buildings so that when the grid goes out, you can maintain power, right? And maintain services for religious organizations or nonprofits that are providing services to the community. And that's great, and everyone thinks that is sufficient. But when you look at it from an energy justice lens, you understand that these communities need more than just the status quo. They need more than just keeping the lights on. They also need revenue generation in their communities. They need to be able to put forth solutions, and that costs money. And so what we developed was what we call a clean energy hub, which actually is a revenue generating resiliency hub, right? So now the community is not just being able to keep the lights on when it's when the grid goes out, which Justice 40 communities, Black and Brown communities, overarchingly are 4 times more likely to lose power, right, in this country. So that is important, but they're also able to generate revenue day in and day out to reinvest into their community, right? No longer being solely dependent on grants and philanthropic dollars. So on one end, looking at environmental justice allows for new, innovative solutions. And quite frankly, these communities understand they're getting the short end of the stick. Now, they may not realize how extensive that gap is, right? So like, for me, the roughest conversations are when you talk with families who for generations have had asthma. And because it's just been, oh, my grandmom had it, my mom had it, I got it. You just think that's genetics, right? Like, oh, that's just natural, you have asthma. And it's like, no, that's because of where you're living and the pollution in your community. But they don't even are able to recognize that because it's been a problem for so long. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that it makes solutions harder to actually implement, right? So a few ways this comes from. One is the divestment that we've all talked about already through policies such as redlining that makes standard energy efficiency upgrades more expensive, right? You have to upgrade your panel if you want to get an induction stove or a new heat pump or some other upgrades, right? Which adds thousands of dollars to that otherwise wouldn't have been needed. You need to, when you look at electrification, we want to electrify all the homes and get rid of natural gas and coal and fuel oil and propane. But these communities, transformers don't have the capacity for that, right? So you're actually dependent on utility companies to upgrade transformers in these communities that they haven't touched in decades. You're dependent on that for you to move forward in your clean energy transition. And once again, people do not have the money to do these changes. And so and this of course brings it back to the importance of the Environmental Justice for All Act, right? That all these challenges have been compounding over decades. And really it's not something that individual communities or local state government can fix. It is essential to have federal intervention for this to change. Otherwise, it's going to be putting a Band-Aid over a gashing wound. And so this is why I'm really excited about the Environmental Justice for All Act, and so thankful that y'all are putting the time and energy into trying to get this to pass.
Thank you for that, Anthony. You know, what you're talking about makes me think about, this is about the EJ for All Act, but also environmental justice in general, to me, is about really trying to empowering communities. As Anthony was saying, these are issues that have compounded over decades, you know, starting back with the New Deal, probably even before that, before it was called environmental justice. But they've compounded over decades, and to unravel it, it takes a bill like this. It takes a bill like the Inflation Reduction Act that had $60 billion for EJ communities for grants and initiatives to unpack it. Because frankly, if we leave it to the states, a lot of places are going to keep getting the short end of the stick that they've been getting for the past 100 years or so. Chris, you know, I'm talking about empowering communities and so forth and all, but you're well aware that the politics of this, well, I want to ask you about the politics of this, because this bill, you know, FCNL always strives to be bipartisan. It's not the easiest thing to do at times, but this bill doesn't have any Republican support. And that's something that this community here would really like to change. But can you speak to what are some of the, and this is a concern that's shared by others in the community, I don't want to put you on the spot, but how do you talk to Republicans about this issue and get them to see that clean water, clean air, and healthy soils isn't a partisan issue? Not to slam them inadvertently, but yeah.
Well, these days in Congress, bipartisan anything is an uphill battle, regardless of the issue. And that's a dynamic that I think we all as citizens have to work towards changing. But on this issue in particular, sadly, some of the most impacted EJ communities are in the deepest of red districts. And I think for me, as both a congressional staffer and as someone who is, concerned and passionate about communities that are impacted by environmental injustice, making clear to members of the other aisle, of the other side of the aisle, that their constituents stand most to benefit from legislation like the Environmental Justice for All Act, is something that I don't think comes through immediately when you first read this legislation. I think reflexively, there's an impulse to write legislation off depending on who the author of the bill is. Well, it's Chair Grijalva. He's a member of the Progressive Caucus. We must be against this. And I think that's one of the real values of the work that you all are here to do, is taking the time to sit down with legislators and their staffs and educating them on just how impacted their constituents are by these issues is half the battle. Because that's how you break down that impulse to write things off on spec, in my view. So I'm going to continue to do that. I know Chair Grijalva continues to do that. I don't think the fact that there isn't a Republican co-sponsor on this bill is reflective of us not trying. We certainly try every day to bring colleagues in both parties along to the importance of resolving these issues for communities in need.
Thank you for that. We've got a room full of people who are going to be definitely trying to pull in a Republican sponsor tomorrow, hopefully. LaTricea, yeah, I was listening to you, and the word that pops up when I was listening to you, but also just on this issue in general, is trust. And I'm curious about the level of trust in these impacted communities that have suffered for decades with this issue. And could you speak to that? How are people, and this is something that maybe everyone on the panel could speak to maybe, but if we have more time, but I just wanted to get from you, how do people feel outside of Washington, DC, in these communities, in the Flints, in Jackson, and they've been promised in the past certain solutions that have never happened or they've been ignored? So could you speak to that level of trust or lack of trust from your perspective?
Yeah, I was just about to say the lack of, so the latter. So there is very much so in communities that are directly impacted by environmental injustice, there's a complete absence of trust. And so that makes work around organizing even more difficult. When you're trying to galvanize people who are so historically and currently disenfranchised, because we have to think about this from a generational perspective as well, that makes the work even harder. So I want to use an example and put this into perspective. So even now, we have seen tremendous investment. I mean, the most that we will ever see in our lifetime around environmental justice. That's great that we got this passed from a federal level. But does it really get to the communities that need it the most? We understand that not all states are created equal. Like my colleague here talked about, some of the most disenfranchised communities are in very much so burgundy, not even red states. When you think about, for example, in Mississippi, where leadership in Jackson have been advocating and asking for funding for decades around the known issues surrounding crumbling infrastructure infrastructure, but did not receive it. But we can't ignore the fact of literally how racist the state of Mississippi is and has been historically, and how that all kind of like coalesces into this perfect storm. And it becomes a battle from a grassroots perspective, where being a person of color, also being from a frontline community personally, balancing like, yes, the government has definitely not proven to be trustworthy to communities that look like my community. However, we are tax-paying citizens, so we can't forfeit it.
Right.
So it has to be a shift in power from being not the victim, but reassuming our power, understanding what that power is and fighting for it. I would even dare to say, and this is a strategy that we use with Black Millennials for Flint a lot, is reflecting on the ancestors. And what it took for people from African descent to get to freedom. If we have a lot more freedoms than our ancestors did, we can't forfeit that.
Right.
And while we do have to reckon and grapple with things that are still very unsavory and does deem to be very untrustworthy, we can't forfeit our investment, because we also, again, we're taxpayers, and we deserve these resources, and we have to continue to fight for them. If it didn't matter, we wouldn't see people stealing votes away from disenfranchised communities. Exactly. And a lot of disempowerment. So I think, yes, there's an absence of trust, but I've used this quote a lot this week, but I think about Malcolm X when he said, a lot of times when you are sad about something, you're sad about it, you lament it, it doesn't necessarily change the condition, but when you get mad, when you get angry about it, even Jesus got mad in the tabernacle, right? When you get mad about it, that's when you really start to see shift and change.
Yeah, it helps. Anger sometimes clears the mind, doesn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's therapeutic.
Yes, yes, indeed. Anthony, I saw you. I saw you smile when LaTricea mentioned whether the money getting to the ground. Would you care to elaborate on your smile?
Yeah. So
But I would ask you that, but I also wanted to ask you about, because environmental justice is about redressing these cumulative harms that have been happening to these communities, but it's also about identifying and being a part of the opportunities of the clean energy future, and giving these communities the ability, it's not giving anybody anything except for what they, as you said, as taxpayers have a right to, but it's also opening up the opportunities that can come from building a sustainable low carbon economy. And we like to say at FCNL, a sustainable low carbon economy with opportunity for everyone. So could you speak to both your smile and your response to LaTricia's comments, and also what do you think of when we talk about opportunities in that low carbon economy?
No, absolutely. So I always like to say, addressing climate change is our responsibility. Doing so in a way that addresses historical inequities is our opportunity, right? There's the trillions of dollars of money is going to be pushed through. We already saw 369 billion. That's just going to be the tip of the iceberg, really, when it's all said and done. And that level of movement, that level of change, of transformation for this whole country also gives us an opportunity to transform and rectify the sins of the past, right? None of us are strangers to how this country was run, right? My dad, for instance, was the first kid to integrate his elementary school. He's 64 years old. It's not like this history is so far away from when it was separate but equal, right? And so when we talk about the history of disinvestment, of gatekeeping from economic opportunity, and even stripping away economic success, like we saw in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? That all those things can start to be rectified in this clean energy transition. And the great news about this is, by doing so, we accelerate our clean energy transition, right? That's something that people miss. They think they oftentimes in the industry, they talk about how that will slow us down. It's like, it'll be really good to do, but it's going to slow us down. And what I teach my students, I teach 2 courses at Stanford University right now, and both of them center around racial equity and energy and an inclusive clean energy economy. And what we show the students by the end of the year, they realize and recognize not just me saying it, but the data, on the ground data shows that equitable and inclusive solutions where you include everybody in the economic development of that accelerates our transition, allows us to start to actually see these climate goals as realistic as opposed to what we all look at as, ooh, it's not looking good. So on the economic side, I think there's science that backs it. There's science research that backs it. There's on the ground data that backs it. We need to include everybody. We need to do workforce development in these communities. We need to start looking at returning citizens, formerly incarcerated individuals, and make sure they are able to be a part of this, right? We need all hands on deck. And right now we are preventing people from even picking up a shovel and doing the work, right? We got to remove those obstacles, those barriers. And to my smile, LaTricea, when she said, where is the money actually going to get there? I started smiling because that's the big issue, right? That's the big fear in environmental justice communities and environmental justice organizations, because we've seen this done before, right? It isn't that this money is just going to fall into people's laps. A lot of the money you have to apply for. And right now, the application processes are still tied to the inequities that exist. An example, to win a grant, you have to show past experience, right? Well, in these communities, they haven't had an opportunity to garner experience. So they're not going to win that grant because it's competitive. To be awarded grant money, right? The amount of money you can be awarded for if you're a nonprofit is based on how much you've had in the past. So the Department of Energy is not going to give you $1 million if you've only been able to work with $100,000 before. What does that mean for those organizations that for so long have been underfunded but overperforming? Right? And so when we think about kind of where's this money going to, over the last few years, and the Recovery Act is a great example of this, right? Obama administration, Recovery Act, hundreds of millions of dollars coming down, and the impact was transient. As soon as that money ran out, so did that movement in those communities. And so we need to kind of make new pathways for this money to reach where it needs to go, instead of being filtered through large nonprofits that then piecemeal it out based on what they think is right, as opposed to what the community is saying is right. And we need to make new pathways so that the money goes more directly to these communities. And we need to do so in a way that is putting that money into sustainable solutions, right? Solutions that when that 369 billion runs out, it was used more of a catalyst to get things going and not as just a prop to hold things up.
You know, it's going to be very interesting as this IRA funding, the bill, the Inflation Reduction Act funding, and the 60 billion for environmental justice. It's going to be something that you and the audience here in your individual states, it'll be interesting for you to keep an eye on that as well, because FCNL, from my position, we're going to keep an eye on the implementation. And Anthony's right, and the panel's right. Whether this money gets to the communities that really need it and that it's targeted for is going to determine a lot about not just the clean energy transition, but people's faith in democracy and whether government can actually do something to help them. So that will be something that we're going to be curious about. Last question I had, and I wanted to ask Chris, and I don't mean to ask you all the hard congressional questions or so, but this issue is related to permitting reform that we've been hearing a lot about. And it always kind of amuses me when people talk about, the EJ for All Act would be another regulatory burden, or it's NIMBYism or whatever. And I said to someone, I was like, it's poor Black and brown communities aren't the ones that have been holding up anything. In fact, it's always in my backyard for these communities. So sort of a legislative strategy question. Do you see, what is your prognostication for the bill, and could you see it maybe being a part of a permitting reform package? Is that what your office is? What does your office hope to see? I don't mean not put words in your mouth, but how do you all see this playing out? What is optimal for you?
Chair Grijalva would like to see every provision of this bill enacted into law, and he's not going to rest until that happens. That said, we have seen several provisions included in the Environmental Justice for All Act move through the Congress, and in a couple of instances be enacted into law through other larger vehicles. It's not everything. And certainly there are provisions in the bill that we consider to be central to providing justice to communities. But we'll pursue any path that we can to advance these provisions. Now, you're right, Clarence. There was a conversation, there continues to be a conversation this Congress about quote unquote permitting reform. That conversation is almost the antithesis of the Environmental Justice for All Act. What Senator Manchin envisioned in his permitting reform proposal was limiting public input opportunities, limiting timelines for adequate review by responsible agencies. And the EJ for All Act does the exact opposite. It ensures that there's robust public input, that public comment opportunities occur in impacted communities, not in some far off regional office away from where these decisions meet the road. Thankfully, because of the work that many communities have done to participate in the building of the EJ for All Act, communities were able to use that momentum to push back on that permitting reform proposal. There was an attempt to include it in what's called must-pass legislation. These are bills that Congress, for various reasons, has to get done. The latest was a continuing resolution to fund the government. They were unsuccessful at doing that. We're concerned that they will continue to attempt that on other pieces of must-pass legislation that we see coming before the Congress. One is the National Defense Authorization Act, and the other is an omnibus spending bill. We're gonna work hard to ensure that that doesn't happen. Now, what is possible this Congress, and what is the prospect of getting a bill like the EJ for All Act enacted into law? Anything is possible with communities banding together and advocating for justice. It's a very high bar, as any legislation is with the current makeup of the Congress. As we all know, on most pieces of legislation, you need 60 votes in the Senate, and that's a really high bar to hit. But if we all do the work, if we continue to advocate for these provisions, then it is absolutely possible that we do that. Legislation often takes several Congresses to become law, but there are some key benchmarks that you can look towards to see whether or not we're making progress. Not every bill that's introduced in the House has a Senate companion bill. we were able to do that. Senator Duckworth is carrying the Senate companion bill to the Environmental Justice for All Act. And that's a key benchmark. Not every bill that's introduced in Congress is able to garner a hearing in a committee of jurisdiction. We were able to reach that benchmark. We held a hearing in the Natural Resources Committee. Not every bill in Congress is able to be marked up and reported favorably out of that committee. We've done that through the Natural Resources Committee with the EJ for All Act. So these are all steps in the legislative process that we can look towards and say, we're making good progress. Now, I'm happy to share with you all that Chair Grijalva plans on sending a letter as early and timely as this evening to House Majority Leader Standing Hoyer, asking for the bill to go before the House for a vote on the floor this Congress. That's the next step in the legislative process. And if we can garner that, that both opens up the opportunity for the Senate to act on this and become law, but it also sets the stage for us starting from that standpoint if and when we reintroduce next Congress. So all of this makes me extremely optimistic about the bill's prospects in Congress, and I hope it substantiates all the hard work that your organization and many organizations across the country have put into this effort, because it really has been a community-led approach.
So thank you for that. My colleague Yush, there he is. I report to Yush now. He's a good guy. He's got a couple of questions from online. Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Clarence, and thank you, panelists, for this really insightful conversation. We will now begin with questions from the Zoom chat. I'll read a few of them to the panel. And so John is asking, how does the appearance of lead in the water escape the notice of those who have the power to make the water clean? LaTricea, I know you spoke a little bit about this at the beginning, so perhaps this is a question for you.
You mind saying that question one more time for me?
Yeah, so he's asking, how does the appearance of lead in the water escape the notice of those who have the power to make the water clean, the legislators?
Yeah, so as it relates to lead in the water, we absolutely know the science that it takes to do it. So it's not like we have to do a lot of investing to figure out what to do. We know exactly what to do. It's all about investment. So it's literally it's the choice between I want to do it or I don't. It's really that simple. So for example, in my hometown of Memphis, we are lauded as having this pristine water because we sit on a aquifer, right? And that's true, but like many cities, we have crumbling infrastructure. And so in the city of Memphis, while we have these phenomenal aquifers, we also have like over 13,000 lead service lines in that city. And it's known. It's not like we just woke up one day and knew that they were there. It's been known for a while. And so even while knowing that, there's a lack of investment. There's a lack of a plan to say, okay, for this amount of time, based on these benchmarks, like we're going to replace all these lead service lines. It's just absent. So that literally means that those stakeholders, those decision makers are making a decision not to act. To make this more on a positive end, if resources were an issue, that can no longer be the issue anymore. So with some of the very specific investments from this administration, where it's a 10-year plan, what makes that really cool is it's a 10-year plan. So it's not just saying we're going to invest like in lead service line replacement. It put a date on it. So that really holds a lot of local government to the fire. So local and state, but particularly at the local level. So your cities, your municipalities are held to a standard that they've never really been held to before. So it's going to be interesting to see from a national perspective, but more so at a local level, who's going to replace these lead service lines, because it's not, if they're there, they're there.
Thank you. And it seems like we need to move on. So I want to invite constituents on Zoom who want to directly ask a question to the panel to raise your electronic hand to do so. And I will then recognize you to speak. So maybe we'll wait for a couple of seconds. If anyone wants to raise your hand, or perhaps I can ask another question while we're waiting for people to raise their hands. So maybe this is a question for everyone. So Penny's saying that she's heard Reverend Ben Chavis speak in the 1980 about environmental racism and about how he had a powerful way of encouraging people to stay hopeful. And so what gives you hope in this vital work that you do?
Well, I would say what gives me hope is the communities that we've met with across the country in this effort to advance the chairman's bill. The resilience, the strength to persevere, even through some of the worst examples of neglect and disenfranchisement. The strength of folks to come out and lend their voice to the kind of future that they want to see. As LaTricea pointed out, you know, there are a lot of communities that have you know, gone to community meetings, exercised their voice, and it's gone into a black hole. And to be able to come out again and again and again, in spite of that, is what gives me hope. One of the concerns that I had when Chair Grijalva wanted to have this robust public input process in the development of this bill is that I come from one of those communities, and I know what it was like being on the ground with my neighbors and with my family, trying to convince them to come out. And the skepticism around that really made me feel like, you know, I'm not sure this is going to work, Chairman. But to see the thousands of comments, substantive comments to a piece of legislation like this, knowing that people took the time to read it, to give us their feedback and input, and to have faith that that we were going to do something meaningful and useful with that, was what inspires me every day.
Seems like we would need to, seems like we would need to move on to stay on the schedule. I
Why
will.
don't we get, we're still good. Let's hear the other two panelists ask
All right.
since we asked the question. Please
Sounds
go
good.
ahead.
I was just saying that was so beautiful to Chris. So mine is a little unique. It's intergenerational. So I am personally so inspired by my ancestors, and I mentioned this earlier. I want to quickly talk about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is most known about like the bus boycotts, right? But a little piece that people don't talk about a lot with Rosa Parks is what it took for her to cast her first ballot. And during that time in history, during Jim Crow, she had to actually take one of the very, very unfortunate literacy tests. And it was, we know all that jazz. I'm not going to give a history lesson. She turned up into that office over and over and over and over and over relentlessly until she can cast her vote. And so when I get tired, 'cause this is hard, this is really hard, and you get frustrated, like you mentioned, it's difficult when you have a community of folks who don't trust the entities that need to do the right thing. It's hard to get energized with that. But just thinking about, like, I have that privilege to go and cast my vote, but someone had to go through that for me. And so it's my duty to do that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, our youth give me absolute joy and hope. Gen Z is everything that I wanted to be as a millennial. Gen Z is so unapologetic. They're what millennials wanted to be. We didn't quite make it. But as it relates to environment, the level of discourse that they're able to engage in, the way that they are able to act and speak and articulate things surrounding environment is something that when I was their age, I literally was unable to do. So you literally have children that are like in kindergarten that are very knowledgeable, and kindergarten is not necessarily Gen Z, but you have a group of young people that are much more astute about environment, and that gives me absolute hope. It's unfair that we borrowed this environment from them and then we're dependent on them to do something better, but they are the hope that gives me joy and the energy I need to go day to day.
Amen. Anthony, real quick from you, and then we have about 10, 12, 15, actually 15 minutes for questions for the audience. I'm keeping an eye on it.
Foolish optimism and my faith.
Yes, faith.
Oh, wow. Okay. That was very succinct. But good though. And I'll just say Generation X saw it all coming, but we were too small to stop the fire. I think we're going to take some questions from the audience now. Am I right on that, Yus?
Yeah, definitely. I want to now recognize Kitty to ask a question. Please unmute yourself, Kitty.
My question is, if you could clarify for us the relationship between the Environmental Justice for All Act and what's going to happen with hopefully money coming from the Inflation Reduction Act for frontline communities. Will this strengthen that? Will that give it more of odds of actually happening, or how will this impact that? Thank you.
That's a great question. There's a lot of ways to answer that, but I'll tell you what stands most out in my mind. Through the Inflation Reduction Act, we are going to see investments in communities at a level that is extremely rare. We're going to see major federal projects roll out across this country. Now, as that happens, we need to remember that major federal projects in most cases require a public input process through the National Environmental Policy Act. And so that's for very important reasons. It ensures that we are not damaging the environment in the process of rolling out these projects. But it also ensures that communities' needs and concerns and voices are included in the process of how we roll those projects out. So one of the very, very critically important features of the Environmental Justice for All Act is that it strengthens that public input process. It ensures that information is provided to communities in languages of predominant usage in those communities. It ensures that there are robust public comment opportunities in the impacted communities themselves. It ensures that community-based organizations on the ground are notified of those opportunities and provided technical resources to develop their own solutions as part of that public input process. So the two very much go hand in hand, and I think one strengthens the other. Now, as great as the IRA investments are and as game-changing as they are. One thing that I'm always cognizant of is that resources, no matter how robust those resources may be, are not policy change. You know, how we got to the circumstances that that we find ourselves in terms of some communities being disproportionately impacted. It's not by coincidence, it's by design. And we need to undo that design through substantive policy change. And that's what the Environmental Justice for All Act represents. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We will now give the audience in the room an opportunity to ask questions. Marcia and Zoe will give you a microphone after Clarence recognizes you to speak. Please.
Let's start over here and then you.
Hi, so this is for Chris regarding the bill. It looked to me like it was establishing a new right to be able to sue the federal government and private sector companies who had violated the environmental health or the public health of a community. And my question is it an unlimited liability that the federal government then is taking on to pay class action suits that would come from that? Or is there a way to limit the liability of the federal government for permitting these things and instead force the class action lawyers to go after the private sector companies that built these things in most cases?
So I'll try and do my best to answer that question, but the intent of those provisions of the bill are really designed to keep the federal government accountable. Now, private sector companies could also benefit from federal funds, and if they do, they have a requirement, as does the federal government, to ensure that those funds are not being used in a discriminatory way. It doesn't necessarily create a new right. There have been a number of court cases that substantiate that what's called disparate impact discrimination is already against the law under the Civil Rights Act. But this does make explicit that disparate impact discrimination will be against the law in an environmental context. Now, the difference between intentional discrimination and disparate impact discrimination, intentional discrimination, essentially to prove that in court, you would need a smoking gun of, an email from, an EPA official, for example, that says, hey, we're going to take this action intentionally to harm Black and brown communities. And that almost never happens. Now, in Flint, we found it. We found the smoking gun. But what disparate impact discrimination essentially says is it doesn't matter what your intent was. What matters is what the effect of the action was. And the effect of the action is that certain communities are being disproportionately and disparately harmed by this action. And the federal government has a responsibility to address that. The provisions of the EJ for All Act strengthen the Civil Rights Act to make that clear. It also enables citizens to sue, to restore their rights, which is not the case right now. Under several interpretations, the entity that has standing in most cases would be another government entity, a state, for example. who is implementing a federal program or accepting and receiving the federal funding to carry out that program. So those are what the provisions do. I don't think it'll create an overly litigious situation around this. I think it just gives the community one more tool to hold their government accountable to equitably and fairly administer federal programs.
I think we've got time for one more question, and right here.
I have a big voice, I could do it without my. We heard in our state training just a few hours ago that this bill has had a hearing before the Natural Resources Committee. They went through markup in the Natural Resources Committee, but it's also scheduled for a number of other committees. Would you suggest that we should be advocating for those committees? My Congresswoman is on one of those committees. Should we push for it to be heard in those committees? Or is it more effective to lobby for a floor vote when we meet with our congressional staff tomorrow?
I would answer that question in two ways. I would say it's helpful for other committees to also hold markups on their portions of this legislation. And that's sort of why bills get referred to multiple committees is, you have one section that deals with public lands, you have another section that deals with clean water and transportation. And so each committee has to resolve those pieces of the bill that are within their jurisdiction. That said, it's not necessary for that to happen. I think where Chair Grijalva is at this point is impressing upon leadership to take this bill to the floor. And I think the more that we all echo that message, the more likely it is to happen. I will say, in answering that question really quickly, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Marilyn Zepeda from our team on outreach and engagement on the committee is with us today. And I would encourage everyone to meet with her and make sure you're on her list, because she does an excellent job at keeping everybody up to date with what the latest developments of the bill are. And so that's the best way to stay plugged into exactly what's happening with this legislation.
You beat me to it. I was going to say, Marilyn has been incredibly helpful connecting us, our community with the committee and on the bill, and grateful for both of you on the committee, and grateful for this panel, Anthony, LaTricea, and Chris, for helping our community get a better understanding of this issue and consider us allies. And thank you very much for joining us. I don't even know what time it is. It's like late night or late night panel, but we really appreciate it. So give it up for If you have any questions, Yosh and I will be around tomorrow to answer them. For the rest of your night.
Great. Thank you so much. Another round of applause. Thank you so much. This was so helpful. And I know people are going to want to take you up on the offer to connect. So thank you so much. I just want to give us a few reminders as we transition to the rest of our evening and look towards tomorrow. We have wonderful time tomorrow on the Hill lobbying, now well-informed, well-empowered. Remember, your story is your expertise, so take it with you. We will gather you can join breakfast for those of you who are on site early at 7 a.m. in the foyer, Regency foyer. We will not expect West Coast folks to join us for breakfast at that time, so hope you have your own good breakfast. And there is unprogrammed worship at 8 o'clock Eastern time that is open virtually and in person, and that will be in this space. And then the rest of the program is in your program, and you will be lobbying much of the day. A few other things, just as quick reminders. I know we're learning as we go here, folks, and there was a lot of chat, and some folks asked that we identify ourselves when we speak. That's always helpful. We don't have little boxes with our names on them when we're together, so it's helpful for folks to identify yourself. And also, there are community agreements on your tables. So that is our community agreement, and we'll remind you about that later. And this bill and our lobbying, I was thinking about what it means for FCNL, and it's not just about all the change we want to see in the policies, but also about living into our commitment as an organization to become an anti-racist organization grounded in justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is in your packets for those who are on site. You get this lovely poster. I'm trying to get it in the screen for folks online. And I bet we can find, for folks online, I bet, Lauren is shaking her head, I bet we can get you one if you would like one. This is drawn from FCNL's statement, and we'll remind you about that too. And please spend some time with that this evening. Thank you, friends. It's been a wonderful beginning, and just a beginning. Rest well wherever you may be. Thank you. See you tomorrow.